Alright folks, well today we're going to talk about the difference between working in RGB and working in CMYK, and why I'm going to recommend that you work in RGB and then convert to CMYK at the end if you have to. And it's something that's come up more lately. A lot of digital photographers are printing their work. And so this question is coming up because we know that the print world is CMYK. So do we work in CMYK all the way through, or should we stick with RGB? So I'm just going to give you a couple of my reasons here, and of why to stay in RGB until you have to switch. The first one here is, let's go take a look at an image here. And RGB is simply a larger color space than CMYK. I actually got this image off of the MIT website, but what it's showing us here is the gamut, and the gamut is just a fancy way of saying the amount of colors that that color space can represent. And forget about the wide gamut for now. Just look at the standard RGB gamut that we have right here, and it's represented by this yellow triangle. And then look at the CMYK gamut, and that's represented by the blue triangle. So the CMYK gamut is smaller than the RGB gamut. One thing to note here, take a look at where the CMYK gamut is larger than the RGB gamut. It's in that greenish and that bluish color range. So that's kind of important to remember, because when you make switches from RGB to CMYK, you're going to notice a lot of your changes happen in the green area if you do see changes. So RGB is just a wider gamut, and here's the thing. When we're looking, see everything on screen here, what you're looking at on screen, that's RGB. Alright, so if you work in RGB, you're getting the most amount of colors you can. It gives you the option to output for the screen, to output for the web. If you have to, you can create a file to send to a printer in CMYK. But you always, when you work in RGB, you always have that option of sticking with RGB and getting the most amount of color. So I think RGB is just a larger color space. The next thing is take a look at your screen here. Okay, what you're looking at is an RGB representation of images and graphics. All right, close this video. What you look at on screen in Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, that's all RGB. Your scanner, all right, your scanner scans in RGB. Your digital camera takes pictures in RGB. So it's what we're used to working with here, okay? It's what our devices are used to working with. Take a look inside of Photoshop. If we look at this image here, go to image mode. Right now it's in CMYK color. Take a look under the filter menu. We have items that are grayed out inside of this image here. So it's Photoshop is, for the most part, it's an RGB program. You'll see items in the menu grayed out when you switch over into CMYK. Next up here is CMYK is generally 25 to 30% larger when it comes to file size. Not the color space itself, but the files are 25 to 30% more heavy. So let's take a look at a photo here. And this is just a real simple example. This is an RGB photo. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save it onto my desktop, and I've got an RGB CMYK folder here. And let's just call this one RGB, and we'll save it as a Photoshop file. And I'm going to hit save. Now, let's convert this over to a CMYK file and go to File, Save As. And again, inside the same folder, I'm just going to call it CMYK. And now we've got two different sized images inside here. And now let's go take a look inside. Let's take a peek inside of this file here, or the folder that I just created. And let's look. CMYK.psd 1.9 megabytes, RGB.psd 1.2 megabytes. So my math might be a little off here, but I'm going to say that that's even larger than 30% difference inside there. But it's just going to vary. But keep in mind, this was a small file that fit 100% on screen here. Imagine what's going to happen when you start working with bigger files. That file size becomes even more of a factor. So it's taking up 25 to 30% more space, and it's also taking, if it's a larger file, it's taking 25 to 30% more time to process. So just keep that in mind as one of the differences of why I think it's better to just work in RGB first. And then the last thing is, I think RGB, and I got this one, I listened to Taz Talley at Photoshop World one time, and he was saying he was a big CMYK guy, and he was talking about how, he feels that he should work in RGB now. It says it's just easier. And he says at first he didn't buy it, but then he started talking about, colors, and if he wanted to create a 10% highlight. Well, in RGB, just go into your color picker, and you've got 0 to 255 as the range of blacks to whites here. So 0 to 255, 0 is black, 255 here is white. So if you want to create 10%, just multiply 255 times 90%, and then you've got a 10% highlight. And it's not that easy to do inside of CMYK. You've got to finesse the numbers a little bit differently. So those are just a few of my reasons why I think it's better to just work inside of RGB. Okay, do all of your work inside RGB. If you're going to be printing to CMYK, if whoever you're sending your files to requires CMYK, well then make that conversion at the end. Don't go back and forth. Okay, every time you go over to CMYK, you lose some of your color information and some of your colors shift. Then when you go back into RGB, well, you got to go back into CMYK again, and the same thing happens. So the more times you do it, the more information that you're going to lose inside of your images and inside of your photos. So if you do need to make that switch, work in RGB, and then at the end, convert it over to CMYK and send that file to whoever you need to. But at least you always have your RGB should you need to display it on screen or on the web or one of those circumstances there. So hopefully I shed a little bit of light for you here on the whole RGB CMYK conversion thing. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it's become more and more of an issue because a lot of photographers are not just printing out on a small desktop printer, but printing pro quality prints right from within Photoshop. So it's important to be able to get this stuff right and get the best print that we can.